Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute. It's wonderful to have you all with us on this momentous day. Our topic for today, of course, are the joint American-Israeli strikes on Iran. We have a terrific panel. I should start, though, by making clear we are going to be on the record, and the session is being recorded. It'll appear later on MEI's YouTube channel. So if you've got others who'd like to watch it, they'll be able to do so later on. And again, we are all entirely on the record. As many of you who have joined these kinds of sessions with us in the past know, I'm not a fan of long introductions. I hate to take the time to do what you can all do by simply using a simple Google search. So I'm joined today by Vice Admiral Kevin Donegan, former commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, which is also the naval component of U.S. Central Command. I'm also joined by Alex Vatanka. Alex is an expert on Iranian affairs. He is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Oh, and I should have pointed out, of course, my mistake, but I should have mentioned the pinnacle of Vice Admiral Donegan's military career, which is that he is, of course, now a distinguished military fellow at the Middle East Institute. And finally, Colby Connelly, also a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and an expert on oil and energy markets. So we will ask Admiral Donegan to handle the military side of things, Alex to handle the Iranian side of things, and Colby to handle the oil and energy sector. With that little bit of introduction, gentlemen, let's dive into this because there is so much to discuss. Admiral, I'd like to start with you. Give us, I apologize. One other thing that I needed to do at the beginning. I do want to caution everyone. We're in the earliest hours of this military operation. It is likely to go on at least for days, potentially for quite a bit longer. We really don't know very much at this moment in time. So we need to temper expectations, and to the extent we can, we will provide you additional information that we may have, but mostly what we're going to be doing is providing you with our expert analysis. On this screen, you've got people with decades of experience on all of these extremely important topics. That's really what we can add at this moment in time. So with that, Admiral Kidd, give us your sense of this operation. What is Epic Fury Roaring Lion all about? What, as best you can tell, is it seeking to accomplish? What targets is it seeking to strike? How is it trying to accomplish its goals?
Yeah, Ken, I think we should start with what is the military mission that was given to the CENTCOM commander? Because, for weeks we haven't had clarity on what that could look like. We knew what forces were put in place, and so I won't talk about that because it's been well publicized, the forces that are out and where they are and such. But what we didn't have clarity on was what was the mission that would be given to CENTCOM commander. And quite honestly, it may have been multiple missions that he was told to prepare for. Brad Cooper is the current CENTCOM commander. He's tremendously experienced in the region and been here involved also, with MEI in the past. So we all know who he is. But what did come clear today is CENTCOM actually posted a message from Admiral Cooper that did spell out, at least in layman's terms, what his mission was. It said it was to dismantle the Iranian security apparatus. And then he also talked about his priorities, that included, of course, what you would expect it to be, the IRGC, because that, as we know, is the security apparatus. Interestingly, different from other countries, it's also the same security apparatus internally and externally. In other words, that is the apparatus that would be reaching out and controlling these missiles. It would control and have oversight of the way that any nuclear programs kind of weaponized would be, but also a portion of that, and Alice can talk more than I can about this, the besiege element of that would be controlling the internal security apparatus that oppressed the protesters. So that was what he listed as his mission. And then and that included as you can imagine, before I get into this piece about leadership, we can look to the timing of this operation to give us an indication as to some of the key objectives of this campaign. What we saw was an operation that happened in the daytime, which is somewhat unique for the United States for operations like this. So I suspect, and I don't know, that the operation was cued by a particular piece of intelligence on where leadership could be congregating or could be most vulnerable, etc. And potentially that a decision was made to do this when the conditions were met, that could be accomplished, and then that was handed to the commanders to determine the best time. The other thing is this operation was also done in conjunction with the Israelis, which tells you that significant planning had been going on because you don't just pull something together like that on short notice. There's planning we saw to bolster that theory. You know that U.S. Planes moved to Israel. We put a carrier strike group close to Israel, likely to help in protection, but also can get within range of their TLAM missiles and others. So with that as a backdrop, in other words, that the timing would be cued by intelligence to make it most effective, likely against leadership. Does that make sense in that regard? And then the other piece that you would see this initial focus of this operation on is to be blunting, degrading, destroying any of Iran's ability to retaliate against our U.S. bases, our forces, our infrastructure that's in the region, and also Israel, because we wouldn't want to be setting up and just depending on our defenses that we put in place, Patriots and THAADs and drone defense systems to blunt this attack. So in his release, Admiral Cooper mentioned that that's indeed, they were going after missile and drone launch facilities. They were going against military airfields. And they also said, we and our partners have defended and are defending and have had initially good results because this retaliatory response has had not an impact on operations. And to this date, and that was a few hours ago, they said they didn't have any known U.S. casualties. But that doesn't mean there won't be in an operation like this. It's a lot of risk in operations like this. So what are we seeing now, and what can we expect more tactically? What we're seeing is clearly there were leadership elements, and I doubt we're going to hear how those panned out, but we will over time sort out, how effective they were. In terms of the tactical side, there is this attacks on their ability to project power. Right? Just think of it in that way. How do we degrade that ability so that they can no longer hold hostage things like our basing, our infrastructure, Gulf partners, etc. And then the other piece is the Straits of Hormuz and the Red Sea, right? And you heard that the president actually call out the Iranian Navy, and he really means the IRGC elements of that Iranian Navy, the ones that harass and board ships or shoot at ships, and of course anything else. So that's what I'm seeing play out in real time. The Iranian responses, I think it's good we just talk about that, and then I'll flip it back to you, Ken. But what's been the Iranian retaliation? I think the first wave we saw was what was probably their script for if they were attacked, what they had told, their different elements. If we're attacked, here's what you do. And then you saw these attacks were not telegraphed. They weren't what we saw, with hey, when they told the Qataris, hey, they were going to do some strikes, it's going to be specifically against Al Udeid. These were much quicker, and they were at almost each Gulf country that we have some kind of capability or have used before. And the ones for certain you can see from the television were strikes of drones and/or missiles into Bahrain, the Emirates, into Qatar. There were reports of Jordan and also Saudi Arabia. I don't have confirmation of all that, but that's where the reporting is. So that initial wave, I would say, would be probably their rehearsed plan. And why I think that's important is what happens next may be helpful as we take this to further analysis, which is who's in charge, and who's calling the shots, and how are the Iranians viewing this? Because one thing that I think everyone on this panel knows, that when the most important thing to the Iranian leadership is their regime survival, right? So if they believe regime survival is significantly at risk, they may throw a lot more into the game in terms of their retaliation. And we know they have thousands of missiles and drones, and now a determination on where they sit with that ability will probably be in what we watch them retaliate with. And so it'll be a good thing to be looking at to understand who's in charge, but also how much they view this as a threat to the regime. I think the difference here is it's not an implied threat given the president's comments. That doesn't mean, I don't think, that he expects the military element alone to impact regime change or affect regime change. Maybe leaderships will, certain elements of the leadership will get killed off, but he basically then said, hey, to the Iranian people, shelter in place, but when this is over, this is your chance to go take your country back. So I don't think he's saying that we're going to go in with ground forces. Clearly, we're not postured for that. I think this is an air campaign that may involve special operations and other intelligence kind of operations, but in essence, that's where we are. And I'll stop there with, well, let me just add one more thing. Be interesting to see how it plays out from the Straits of Hormuz side and whether Iran plays that card, which can include some relatively I wouldn't say easy, but relatively simpler for them to implement, saying they mine the Straits of Hormuz and therefore closing it for some period of time because we verify it's open. But I do think that some of these initial attacks went straight at a bunch of the capability that they would normally employ and things like that, and also with their shorter range ballistic missiles. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions, and we can move on to a little bit of the analysis part.
Yes, that's great stuff, Admiral. And I'm so glad that you made any number of those points. One in particular, I think, is really important and leads to a follow-up I have for you, which is the point that you just made that this is almost certainly Iran's pre-scripted response, right? And the fact that, yes, what comes next will probably be much more revealing about how the regime is thinking about certain things.
And their capability. Again, in other words, could be both, right? How
Right.
they may want to do more, but our impact of our operation is getting very quickly potentially at that or not.
Yeah. And so you raised the Strait of Hormuz. That struck me as perhaps a more improvised one where they just simply warned. How fast could they start interdicting shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, in your sense? And if they wanted to just float some mines, are they ready to start taking shots at tankers coming through? When could that start up if they decided that they wanted to actually do that?
Yeah, so the two probably most or three most likely ways that they can get at shipping, I wouldn't think that they're going to go Navy to ships. Instead, I would think that for one thing, they could deploy ships that just put mines there and then announce that it's now closed. They could launch their cruise missiles at a tanker just to get the burning ship in the middle of the Straits of Hormuz. Those are clear signals, and that could be done by a missile or a drone. And they have very capable cruise missiles, most of which were left untouched in previous campaigns, because what the Israelis focused on their campaign when they were going toe to toe with Iran, so to speak, was on the missiles that could more reach Israeli space, right? And what their Iranians were left with was still thousands of missiles, hundreds that can still reach Israel, but thousands that can range Gulf nations and the same things with their drones and cruise missiles that can reach the Straits of Hormuz, which, as we all know, is very, very short. The Houthis also came up on the net in the early script saying, stand by, we're ready to do something too in the Red Sea. I haven't heard of an action there done yet. But again, I would say that was probably on that initial script, and I would look to see them doing something there. We already have reports, and I want to be careful about this, of some things going off in residential areas and stuff. That will be difficult to unpack right now because some of that could be actually errant missiles, or they could be missiles that were shot down, or even part of the defensive missiles that come apart after they hit the target and such, that fall and do death and in a bad area that where the population is. So just because we heard that there were some things going close to residential areas, I would say don't. We're going to have to look at that happen more over time to understand if that's the Iranians doing the targeting or it's just a byproduct of, the inaccuracy of weapons and the potential amount of defensive forces that are being applied against these missiles and drones as they're coming in.
Terrific. All right, Alex, I'd like to bring you in. The Admiral already took your name in vain, rightfully so. Give us your sense of the reaction in Iran. And here, why don't we start with the regime itself? And then in a few minutes we'll come back and let's talk about your sense of where the Iranian people are. But for the moment, let's just give us your sense as best you can. Again, we're in the very early hours, but of where you think the regime is on all of this.
Thanks, Ken. Look, as you said, very early hours. What I've been able to pick up in terms of the statements coming out of Iran is this desire to show that they're not in a state of panic, that they're ready to fight. Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, others from the foreign ministry, a number of other senior officials basically echoing the same message that we're ready for the long fight. We're not running. And yet it was interesting to me when questions were asked, for example, of Araghchi, where's the rest of the leadership in terms of the supreme leader, the president? He wouldn't confirm anything, really. He said, I think I remember him saying, I can't confirm to that effect what's happening with the rest of the team. So I don't know if that's deliberate or they really is a case of having lost contact inside in terms of where the regime is. Various parts of the regime are hiding, if you will, assuming they are hiding at this point. I think one of the things we've seen, internet has been partially put down, not full, the way it was during the January protest movement, where it sort of disappeared. It seems to be the case that phones are still more or less working. At least that was the case a couple of hours ago. Internet seems to be down to some extent, but others were telling me that there's access. So I'm not sure what that means, but somebody was making the point to me that if they can put down internet, maybe that means the person in charge of putting down internet is no longer in that role, which is interesting. I don't know if that makes sense, but I sense when I look at the footage again, the security forces seem to be out in places where they feel they need to be in case people rise up. That's one of the key issues. Again, the Islamic Republic has been talking about this openly for some time. That they don't think next round, meaning right now, would be just this interstate warfare case of U.S. Israel versus Iran. That they consider what they call the hybrid warfare, which big component of the hybrid warfare strategy is that you have the Iranian people come out the streets and you kind of go on a two-front attack from inside by the Iranian people, and the U.S. and Israel are, doing their part from outside. I think when I look overall at the retaliation, the Admiral was talking about it. I mean, some of the scenes that I watched from Erbil and KRG, Jordan, the Gulf states, I sort of left thinking what they're trying to do for now, because they're not going after strategic assets. They're going after the psychological factor. They're trying to create shock, if you will, to that, and they seem to be doing that. I heard what the Admiral said, but I suspect when I put two and two together in the short few hours that we've seen the evidence of this, it's more of trying to create, if you will, pressure on the leadership in the various Gulf countries in that hope, because I think this is how the Iranians look at it, that the Gulf leaders do have leverage over President Trump. I think that's what they're trying to do, and as opposed to, throwing what they have at the best targets they can find on the other side of the Persian Gulf. That could happen. I think if the regime really felt that this is it, this is the last fight, this is the fight of survival, and I've said this, Ken, you've heard me say it many times, then they will throw everything they have at it. How much of that will be left in the next few days? I'm assuming the U.S., Israel are now pinpointing the targets to take out, whether it's trying to stop missiles from the other side of the Persian Gulf landing on tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, or strategic assets on the other side of the Gulf. I suspect if we come to that point where Iran decides I have to throw everything I have at this problem, at this challenge, then the question is, how much will U.S. and Israel between now and then have eliminated? And if they do a good job at it, then Iran might not actually have that capacity to retaliate in the sort of way that at least the rhetoric today suggests. That's a big question mark for me. I've seen some signs in terms of Iranian public pockets of sort of showing celebration, if you will, which we also saw during the 12-day war. I don't want to read too much into that just yet, because celebration is not something that surprises me, because I think fundamentally the Iranian public mood on this is a fight between the United States, Israel, and the regime versus, this has been a fight between US, Israel, and the people of Iran, the country of Iran. I think there's an important distinction to be had. I think the Iranians, by and large, in terms of public sentiment, gets that. But obviously that could change. Already the reports of a school of girls being hit with over 50, 60, so casualties of children. If that sort of thing becomes the norm in the next few days and weeks, and I agree with you, Ken, this is probably not going to end in hours. Even though if US and Israel wanted to end in hours, I think it's going to be at least weeks probably, if not longer, if regime change, which seems to be what the president wants, is the ultimate objective. Then the question of what that will do to public sentiment in Iran is a factor that I'll keep an eye on, when civilian casualties start rising. So, because they invariably will. I mean, the idea that there won't be any collateral damage, to use that cliche, is obviously, I don't think that's the case here. I look at one other thing, Ken, and I'll stop, which is, and again, this is what the Admiral also pointed out too, the regime now has much better sense in terms of what the end objective is from US and Israel point of view. If they ever had any doubts in the last few months, that doubt presumably really is eliminated, which is that the US and Israel are after regime change. This is not a set of attacks to prod Iran to come back for more talks next month to give the US more concessions on the nuclear front. This is something different. So they're in this fight for their survival, which I think is an important, it's an important factor, because it could create new dynamics inside of Iran. I was just speaking to a media outlet before, they're talking to me about, would the regime fight Trump to the very end, if you will? And I said, well, that's one thing they could do. Another way of looking at it, if you're sitting in Iran, is kind of come to the conclusion that the set of policies of the Islamic Republic are why the country is where it is right now, experiencing second round of major conflict in less than a year. So the problem is the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, it's the leadership in the IRGC. Their collective decisions over decades is what brought the country to this point. So I do wonder in terms of whether there will be a change that we didn't see during the 12-day war, a change in the willingness on the part of people who are sort of rank and file in the regime to say, this is it. The Americans, and there's an American president who's going to be in the White House for 3 more years, and he doesn't seem to give up on Iran. And Bibi Netanyahu for sure is not going to give up on Iran. So there might be a moment for them to actually sort of try. Again, this is a big if and speculation on my part, but I can see the context here matters and could be relevant. Well, you have that sort of internal inter-regime sort of dynamic changing in favor of marginalizing Khamenei, marginalizing whatever is left of the IRGC leadership, which, by the way, could be part of the US and Israeli thinking right now with some of these assassinations that have been reported, and then create the sort of conditions for that, part of that regime to come out, not necessarily waving the flag, but basically that's what they have to do. And then if that could become a reason for the conflict to be wrapped up. I think President Trump is thinking along those lines. I don't think that's going to cut it for the Iranian opposition, because they want something far more fundamental in terms of a political change. But yeah, I think this is different in that sense from the 12-day war. This is about regime change in a clear-cut manner with a US president who's now invested in it in ways that you could say he wasn't back then. And I do wonder if that clarity in terms of what the US is looking after is going to shape calculations differently this time around inside of Iran, and those inside the regime who might be on the fence willing to consider, if you will, leave the regime tent and look for a way out of this. Let me stop.
And a quick follow-up for you.
Yeah.
What will you be looking for as signs that this regime is collapsing, right? The Israelis are apparently Prime Minister Netanyahu came out and said increasingly believes that Ayatollah Khamenei was killed, which, by the way, we all recognize that may or may not reflect the collapse of the regime. He can die and still be succeeded by any number of other people who would keep the regime intact. But what would you be looking for? What indicators or warnings are you going to be concentrating on in the days ahead to give you a sense that this regime really is collapsing?
Look, if the protests come back out in the streets in large numbers, and again, you've heard me say this, back during the January protest, you had about 900 locations, 400 cities, towns, over around 1.5 million people based on official estimates that came out of Iran. Anything like that comes out in the streets again, given where they are, being under so historic pressure by the US and Israel and presumably not operating normally, because they know that you can't go out and kill people now the way you could back in January, because the Americans, the Israelis are watching overhead, and you are a target in ways you weren't before. So that immunity they had, that where they could come and kill, is no longer going to be there. I mean, the regime obviously back in January can kill the way it did in such an indiscriminate manner because they were seeing a day like this. They were anticipating a day like this. The way they killed people, even kids, was meant to say for a long time, do not ever think to do that again. In fact, what I'm telling you is being expressed on Iranian national TV as of now. I mean, folks associated with Revolutionary Guards are on TV saying, make sure you don't come out. Don't think this is the moment for you to act opportunistically and stand against this regime. We're going to be able to handle both the external threat and the internal threat. But that's a big question mark. That's a huge question mark. So for me, that is, the clarity on the part of the United States is started to show itself. I don't know if President Trump's going to have the willingness to commit to this in the long term, because if he does, he needs to start investing in a different way in terms of the messaging, because that helps. If he wants to bring defections from inside the regime, which will make the fight much less of a burden for him, then he needs to start, he's already talked about amnesty. Well, an amnesty is a good start, I guess, if you're inside the regime looking for a way out, but you need to provide more reassurances. That means President Trump has to go in the direction of sort of investing in political change in Iran that he's hoping the Iranian people will do on their own, but it's frankly something that he can help with a long way if he wants to go there. But I think that's the thing I would say, Ken. The protesters coming out this time around, not being butchered the way they were in January, and at some point the dam bursting. Because again, psychological factor is huge here. There's clarity essentially around the part of the US that they want regime change. Iranian people want regime change. There are people that are sort of keeping this regime together for now, but I'm assuming many of them would be ready to defect and jump if they felt the right time was now. So that's the one thing I'll look for, Ken.
That's great, Alex. All right, Colby, talk to us about the energy markets. Again, the Revolutionary Guard are telling people to stay away from the Strait of Hormuz. What's the situation like? What do you anticipate when the oil markets open again tomorrow? How should we be thinking about the impact of all of this on energy markets?
Thanks, Ken. Well, as you pointed out when we started the session, there is a lot that we don't know about the way things are continuing to unfold. So what I'll start with is what we do know about the situation in the region, and kind of take it from there into what we should be thinking about in the days ahead. The first thing to be very, very clear about in terms of the way energy has been impacted in the region is that there has not been any actual impact to production at this time. There's nothing that's taken place akin to, the big example is the attack on the Abqaiq facility in Saudi Arabia in 2019. There around the region have been a couple of different shut-ins out of an abundance of caution. Israel has shut 2 of its offshore fields, not unprecedented. The Kurish and Leviathan fields are offline. It's done that during periods of conflict before for a number of years. The Hormuz gas field in Iraqi Kurdistan is shut down, and a couple of other operators in the KRG have suspended production. But Hormuz in particular has a history of being attacked by drones a number of times. So again, we're not seeing anything unprecedented or anything that feeds into the global oil and gas market in a big way at this time. While there were some early reports of an explosion at Kharg Island, which is where Iran's main oil export terminal is, there hasn't been any sign or confirmation since that time that the facilities themselves were damaged in a big way, or that there's a major outage in terms of Iran's ability to keep exporting, at least from an infrastructure point of view. Maritime shipping may be a bigger question in the coming days. But beyond this, oil and gas in the region are still coming out of the ground. And it's everyone's on high alert. International companies that we've spoken to here in the region over the last few hours say that they have certain contingencies in place, but are largely operating as normal. However, what has happened has mostly been an impact on shipping so far, and this doesn't, of course, just apply to oil tankers and LNG carriers. It applies to containers and other forms of shipping as well. But on the shipping side, what has happened is that a lot of operators have gotten very skittish about transiting the strait and entering the Gulf, or at this point exiting it as well. I'm looking at a terminal that's got ship tracking on it right now, and there's a very low level of activity in the Gulf. There's a huge buildup of tankers around Fujairah and a couple other places inside the Gulf as well. So what this may have the effect of doing over the next couple of days, while we have this level of volatility, or however long this continues, is that it may have the effect of limiting the supply of tankers that are able to get into the Gulf and move supply out. Loadings are continuing essentially normally, as far as we're aware, in pretty much every one of the Gulf countries, but not having the tankers to put the supply into, that's a totally different question. What will also happen, and what has also happened in a situation like this, is that insurance rates for tankers will go through the roof. They may simply become unobtainable or unaffordable for some operators as well. Now, a lot of that is due to what you pointed out, with Iran saying that the strait is closed. Maybe some of the finer points of that are more of a question for the admiral, but Iran saying that it's closed doesn't necessarily mean it is, but it's of course enough to be taken seriously by mariners, and then that will of course have the impact on the availability of tanker supply. And of course, Iran has not touched any tankers or any shipping yet, but there's plenty of precedent for them to do that. And in a situation like this, I think everyone would understandably take any threats to do so quite seriously. And based on the flow of traffic through the strait right now, it certainly looks like almost everyone is. What also has happened, and this was reported over the last couple of days in the run up to where we are now, is the reports that Saudi Arabia and the UAE and potentially some others in the Gulf did boost oil output ahead of the weekend in an attempt to get more supply out of the Gulf and put it into storage overseas. That is also not something that's without precedent. Excuse me, late over here, but that happened during the 12-day war in the summer. The Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait did increase production significantly, so that if there were to be an outage, they would be able to keep up deliveries to their buyers for as long as possible. Of course, overseas storage is finite. It will eventually run out. And so there's a limit on how much of a solution that is for what's really going on. So to go to what could happen, we'll have to see how things play out in the next 24 hours or so. But, in the run up to where we are now, over the last week and a half, oil has been trading. Brent crude oil, which is the main international benchmark, has been trading with a risk premium of about $8 to $10 above what a lot of analysts would consider the fair fundamental price. So in other words, that $8 to $10 is a geopolitical risk premium in anticipation of something potentially happening in the Gulf. The fair fundamental price is where it would be if these geopolitical risks were not a factor. And by the way, they don't only emanate from the Gulf. There are issues in other places where they're present, but the main premium is being added by the Gulf right now. I think that we can conservatively expect oil to start trading at $80 a barrel, probably above, when trading resumes tomorrow, which will be a risk premium, because as I pointed out, there's been no actual supply outage yet. So if we are to see a supply outage, it could and likely will go higher than that. How long it remains there depends on, of course, how long hostilities continue and risks remain elevated in the Gulf. plus how long it would take to replace any potential supply outage if one does emerge. Now, a potential moderating force on that is the fact that OPEC Plus has an unintentionally fantastically timed meeting tomorrow. And they could decide that they resume their supply additions, which had been paused for the first quarter of this year, at a rate faster than they did for a lot of 2025, which consisted of additions of about 137,000 barrels a day each month. There were countries that did overproduce and underproduce. So the additions usually ended up being a bit below that figure. So that's where the real risk factor comes in here, because most of OPEC Plus spare capacity is in the Gulf. So if it can't get out, then it doesn't really do a lot to put downward pressure on prices. There are other ways that Saudi Arabia can move roughly 7 million barrels a day out of the country via the Red Sea by the East-West pipeline. The UAE can pump around 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels a day to Fujairah through the ADCOP pipeline. And then Iran, with the Josk terminal, has about 300,000 barrels a day that it can get outside the strait. But that is not an amount of supply that is nearly enough to make up for what would be lost if, in theory, the spigot were to be just totally cut off by a closure of the strait or conditions that were too dangerous. So I would, I think, for the moment, leave it there because there are certainly a lot of moving parts with this. I think there's a much greater fear that production could be directly hit or impacted this time, certainly than last time around. And there are some longer term questions about, of course, what happens inside Iran too, and how that affects production. But for the moment, that is essentially the lay of the land.
So that's great, Colby. And you managed to answer the follow-up question that I was going to ask in the middle part there. So that's terrific. All right. So for the audience, I'm going to ask another round of questions to all three of the speakers, projecting out a little bit further in the expectation that this is going to go on for at least days, if not weeks, or God help us, longer than that. If you've got questions, certainly when we're done, be glad to take some questions from the audience. Please write your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom. If you're not familiar with that, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A button. It's located between the green share screen button and the show captions button. Just click that. It brings up a dialog box. Write your questions in there. And as I said, we'll take a few of those after we get done. Admiral, I want to come back to you. And first, I know you had a comment you wanted to make. There was something that Alex said that kind of caught your imagination, which is terrific. Sorry about that. It's been a busy day here, as everybody knows. But Admiral, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the longer term. And in particular, you and I have had this conversation, changing regimes through air power alone, it's been difficult, historically speaking. And, unclear that we actually have any kind of a ground component. Even if we look at a place like Libya in 2011, right, we had a huge popular protest movement on the ground with actually lots of Libyan military personnel mixed up in there. We don't seem to even have that just yet. So how should we be thinking about how this might play out over the longer term? Again, assuming that the president's goal really is regime change, because again, we should recognize this is a president who seems to like misdirection, right? He's fooled us all on several occasions. But if his goal really is regime change, how should we be thinking about this over the long term? Kid, you're muted.
Yeah, the life of Zoom. Let me add something here to what Alex said that'll set the stage to answer that question a little bit better, I think. So, long term is an interesting thing because it's what is long term here. There's a long term end state to this, and how long that's accomplished is one of the things we don't know. And then what happens after that this thing is over. Those are two ways to look at long term. But Alex mentions some things related to what could happen, and here's one of the issues that and some indicators that he had on to look for. Here's one of the things that makes it even more difficult to understand what's happening in Iran internally. It's not just that their internet's down and that some of we're going to find out how much leadership these leadership attacks were successful. But if let's assume some element of them were. So now you have some removal of leadership here at the higher level in the Iranian government. But you also have this ongoing attacks and strikes from the United States and Israel, which some portion of would have been to disrupt their ability to communicate amongst themselves, right? They'd be trying to sever the ability of whether it be the supreme leader, whether it be the leaders of the IRGC, or whatever, they specifically being trying to disrupt and destroy their ability to talk amongst themselves. And the reason is that way it's harder for them to organize the retaliation against our forces and stuff. When you do that, it'd be hard for any country that had some element of their leadership removed and their communications removed to then not only call the shots, but for even us to then understand what's happening amongst the government, because who is stepping up to be in command? And internally, and Alice can maybe talk to this, some of these folks have watched their counterparts disappear in the middle of in the middle of this thing, and they don't know how they were found out, and they're going to be somewhat reluctant to come up on their normal communication paths and stuff, and even do their daily routine. So that's going to make it more difficult for us to answer some of these questions, because what would normally happen to Iran in a situation like this it is hard to apply given the uniqueness of this situation. The other thing is I wanted to mention was the closure of the straits thing that Colby said. It doesn't matter if they've done something to close the straits, even if they didn't do anything and they only said it doesn't even matter that. As a mariner, ships aren't going to stick their nose into the straits right now, right? They're going to hold where they were, and it'll be in some waters that they think are safe on either side and away from this choke point where they could be the first one to have a message made of. And that's for two reasons. Their number one thing is to protect their crews and the safety of their crews that are on these ships, so they're not going to put them there. Number two, insurance rates will have immediately gone up, as Colby said, to even make that transit. So that's going to be something that they'll consider. So I put that there. And then the other thing that I think we have to factor into this is in situations like this, Iran typically plays the Gulf nations, Europeans, others, to try to, and this is something Alex mentioned, to try to influence the United States into doing things, right? And that's part of these attacks we talked about or in those countries. So, but what was interesting is I would just take as one example the Saudis' message that they put out. They didn't come out and necessarily initially condemn the United States and Israel for these horrific attacks, on the nation of Iran. Instead, they actually condemned the Iranians for tacking onto their soil of the Arab countries that were in the region. You should all read that statement that was put out by their minister, because it's a little bit telling. In other words, it's not working in alignment with what the Iranians would have hoped. So longer term, this one's really tough. Because it's diluted by what I said. Is if somebody, who's gonna step up and lead the country? Well, naturally, when there's some issue with leadership, it's the IRGC that's going to take control and be giving the orders. What if elements of those folks are gone? Then how far down is it? How much, and that their communication is disrupted becomes very, very, very difficult. So that's the short-term, long-term part. In other words, it's going to take time. And that's why trying to figure out where this is going to go in the first day is very, very difficult. So I want to jump to a broader time horizon, and then I'll to get it to answer to your question. In the broader time horizon, one of the most dangerous times you can be is a failed state, right? We've seen this constantly in the region. When you have some other country that's in disarray. I think we're somewhat fortunate that this failed state doesn't have a nuclear weapon now, or we'd be having even a more different question. But here, what we're going to see, though, is none of that stuff will become as clear as quickly as we want. I really think that that's going to evolve over a period of time, and there is an opportunity potentially here that it can go in a direction that's better than it was before. There's an opportunity it can become more hardline, right? And there's an opportunity of it to be somewhere in the middle. That's yet to be told, and it won't be defined by the use of military force. It's going to be defined potentially by conditions those forces set, but which one of those is achieved can't be defined by the use of military force, if that makes sense. In other words, the president isn't able to go, hey, now you guys go do this because I want this outcome in who's going to be in charge in Iran. And I think that was foretold even in the president's remark, and he said, you, the Iranian people, will now have your chance to determine how your country is going to be governed. So that's how I see this playing out. And the great hope here, though, is in the time period that you have where they're sorting their leadership out, they don't have as much capability to reach out and cause the damage that they have in the past, right? In other words, they're going to be significantly degraded in their capability to cause really bad things from happening, because I believe this operation is aimed at, significantly degrading that capability across the span, whether it be naval, whether it be missile forces, or drone forces and that kind of thing.
Terrific. Okay, Alex, over to you. And again, I'd like you to think a little bit longer term as well. And here, I'd like you to think about, we'll talk about a couple of scenarios. So one, let's imagine that Ayatollah Khamenei has been killed. Give us a little bit of a sense of how this regime could survive that. But then let's also switch gears and talk about, if this regime starts to come apart, the inevitable question of the day after. And, lay out some scenarios for what Iran after the Islamic Republic might look like. So first, the Islamic Republic without Khamenei, and then Iran without the Islamic Republic.
So Ken, Islamic Republic without Khamenei, but pretty much everything else in place wouldn't be much that different, because Islamic Republic has been run essentially in terms of daily affairs by a group at the top of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards. I would argue probably starting, you could go back as early as 1999 when Khamenei first panicked about the reformist movement of the Khatami and gave power to the IRGC. And IRGC has been on this run for more power for decades, and they're running, much of the security, planning and operations at home, what they do in the region, including today with the firing of the drones and the missiles. So Khamenei being gone, everything else being there, yeah, to me that is not necessarily going to be. Actually, you could say you've just done Khamenei a favor, because he's been looking for this martyrdom for some time, and he would hope that people will remember him as the Ayatollah who was taken out by the Americans and the Israelis, not the Ayatollah that gave the order to kill tens of thousands of Iranian protesters. So, yeah, I think we need to be a bit more. I mean, look, we at the Middle East Institute, I don't have to remind you, Ken, we don't do advocacy; we just provide analysis. So I'm kind of finding myself a bit slightly uncomfortable terrain here when it comes to prescription, but let me just give it a go in terms of, to Admiral's point, in the long term, a potential scenario could be the failed state. But that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is that the Iranian people, given the rich history, 5,000 years of living together, 120 years this year of proven track record of seeking political representation and essentially a life where their dignities are respected, that they come together and they look at the opportunity of this war, not in terms of the unfortunate loss of life that there will be, has been, but also as an opportunity for them to sort of, if you will, again, I hope doesn't sound like cliche, but and I don't have to repeat what President Trump's been saying. Many others have been saying that their destiny is obviously in their hands. So that could be another alternative, that you have this internal Iranian dynamic being born that says, you know what, 47 years of militant Islamism really did us no good. We need to go in a different direction. And I think plenty of people, a clear majority of Iranians who are outside this regime believe that, vast majority of them. And I think actually a good part of the regime rank and file believe that. I think I would go as far as saying probably a good part, if not a majority, of the rank and file in the Revolutionary Guards believe that. You remember, Ken, when Khatami got elected in 97, everybody was surprised how many Revolutionary Guard members voted for the reformist guy. So yes, there is the ideological component in Revolutionary Guards that will want to be in this fight. They have now a beef in this game. Their comrades have been killed. They want to prove that they're worth the money that's been spent on them. But I think that would distract us from the majority, who actually probably also would be open to the idea of the country going into different directions. Certainly, if Khamenei is gone, that is even more of an opportunity. But that takes me to the issue of the role of the United States in particular. Look, Israel obviously has a role, and Israel's been wanted this regime change. In the case of Bibi Netanyahu, going back to the early 1990s, that's not a secret. We all know that. But Israel doesn't have the capacity to stay in the long game in the sense of a political transformation project, and therefore we can't bank on Israel here. I mean, they can do what they want to say in terms of supporting the Iranian people, but when it comes to the capacity part, it's the United States that needs to make a decision. Is this something I want to engage in or not? President Trump obviously has committed to a short-term war. He has convinced himself this is going to be a short-term campaign. He's starting going the direction of justifying for regime change. We heard what he said. He put out the grievances of the United States the last 47 years and said that's why we're taking action now. Now, I think if he decides to go there, and this is the part where I'm, advocacy essentially, and I have to be careful, but you could be clear about that messaging. I think those people, and I think there's a lot of folks inside of Iran, in that regime, who are on the fence, but do not want to go down with Khamenei, do want to live another day. And if you can be more forceful, more clear, and find ways for them to give them off-ramps, to give them reason to jump ship, then this regime obviously will be out of foot soldiers to do the killing, which is exactly what they have depended on to stay in power. The legitimacy part of this regime was gone long time ago. The only reason they stayed in power is because their ability to repress. And you take that away from them, then I think, Iran could go in a different direction. So I can just hear a lot of Iranian oppositionists and so forth who shouting, saying, well, what are you saying? You want the same regime, just change color. That's not what I'm saying. I just said Khamenei going away and IRGC taking over. That means, in fact, represents no change. No, Iran needs to end the experiment with Islamism. That's what brought this disaster on the country and, frankly, in the region. And so they need to essentially discard with the past, go in a different direction. But I think Iranians in Iran are the ones who should be in the driver's seat in terms of the future of the place. Of course, the opposition outside, Crown Prince Pahlavi and many others, they have a significant role to play. They're the eyes and ears of the Iranian people around the world, can contribute greatly. But I don't think anybody expects the opposition from outside to fly in tomorrow to Tehran, kind of like Ayatollah Khomeini did in 79 and take over. The ground hasn't been prepared for that yet. That could happen. That's a scenario, but you got to prepare the ground. The first important thing you do to prepare that ground is to create those defections, is to start hollowing out the regime from within. That could be helped greatly by more clarity in the part of the United States, where everybody understands President Trump has a tough balancing act. He's got the politics in the United States tomorrow, or not tomorrow, the day after, on Monday, when we go back to work, what kind of pushback is he going to get? That's going to be a factor for him. But the other part is, as we discussed, he could sort of say, we're very close. This is what many of those who have been advocating for this conflict are saying. We're very close. The regime is rotten. Don't lose sight. Invest a bit more, and you will be the savior of the Iranian people. Obviously, that could be kind of almost a movie script, but in fact, it could happen with the right sort of investments. Because I go back to one thing, Ken, and I'll stop here. The people of Iran want this regime gone. So at some point, there won't be gas in the tank if the people aren't there. And that's how I look at it. Maybe too optimistic, but it's definitely a scenario to keep in mind.
Great. Thanks, Alex. All right, Colby. On the oil front, the energy front, the question I've got for you is also this longer term one of, you presented a scenario where for the moment, things look pretty steady. There'll probably be some upward pressure on prices, but nothing disastrous. How long can that obtain, right? How long before things get really bad? You kind of left us with the ominous statement at the end of your initial round of, that doesn't take into account the impact on Iranian domestic production, right? What are some of the scenarios? What should we be thinking about in terms of oil prices over the longer term?
Well, it's, a lot of this will depend on how things play out inside of Iran, because Iran right now produces roughly 3.3 million barrels a day of oil, which is enormous. It's really one of the largest producers in OPEC, and one of the largest worldwide, aside from some of the top, like the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Russia. It's certainly up there. So I think in the longer term, we could really be looking at a very significant loss of supply from Iran. Now, of course, where exports are concerned, there's really only one buyer of Iranian oil, and that's China. They'd love to continue to get the discounted crude that they do get from China, but they are not going to be facing a disaster without it. China has taken advantage of lower oil prices over the last year or so to build massive amounts of new storage, which they've filled up as quickly as they can. It's always kind of a black box in terms of information. There probably aren't that many people outside of Beijing that know how much storage they have. But point being is that while they'd hate to lose again that lower cost supply anyway that they get from Iran, they won't be facing disaster without it. If the situation in the wider Gulf is stabilized, if production is not hit elsewhere, if shipping can resume through the strait at normal levels, the supply loss from Iran is not something that OPEC Plus can't make up for. It might have to do a little bit of work on that, because it typically does like to maintain some kind of a spare capacity cushion, so that the market psychologically knows there can be more capacity to tap if that needs to happen. But what that will depend on inside of Iran is how well the oil sector is able to function if we do go through a change in government. The oil sector is run by a national oil company, by the NIOC, the National Iranian Oil Company. So it depends what kind of shape NIOC is in through any transition that comes up in the future. It's an oil sector that certainly has retained more talent, despite being in dire need of much more investment and international technology. The expertise is there. Countries like Venezuela, where the infrastructure was crumbling and the expertise had left the country, are in a much different state of affairs. And for international investment, it's too soon to say something like that for sure. But Iran would be a much more attractive destination than Venezuela as well. Not all barrels are created equal. Iran does have those low-cost barrels that are so attractive to companies that like to come to the Gulf. And so that kind of resource base is there. It could certainly be of enormous value to any new government in Iran. But it would need a lot of work and international investment. Where that could take prices, again, depends. Like I said, OPEC Plus could, in theory, make up for a lot of that. You have SPR releases from the United States that could happen from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It's been refilled somewhat. It's somewhat above half its capacity of 700 million barrels. But certain releases could be coordinated from the U.S. and from other countries in order to try and have some downward pressure on price if there is, again, a massive loss of supply. You do have to be cautious with that. If there are supply outages and you want coordinated releases of reserves, you have to make sure that it's really, really necessary. The analogy that gets used fairly frequently is that it's like paying rent out of your 401k. So it's something that has to be managed with caution. But in the longer term, I'd say I think the most likely supply outage could come from Iran if there's a big internal transition, and the oil sector just does not have the leadership or the governance from a state level to make it through. I don't think it would go to zero in that situation. You see production continue to take place in very difficult situations all over the world for a long time. I mean, Syria is a smaller producer, but still there were barrels being pumped out of the ground there throughout the entire time that the country was at war. So it remains to be seen. Again, the internal circumstances will be what defines that. But I think that is what one of the factors are that we can see most clearly at this point.
Terrific, Colby. Okay, so got a bunch of questions, and fortunately, a number of them, I'm going to be able to group a whole bunch of them, which is always terrific. I'm going to start with you. We have got a lot of questions from people wanting to know about both our stockpile of munitions and our capacity to maintain this level of operation, both in terms of defending our allies and our assets in the region, but also this power projection campaign against the Iranians. So give us a sense, if you can, about our ability to sustain all of this activity for however long it's going to take. Again, given the fact that historically these kinds of operations can take some time.
So the way that I would answer that is if we look at the way I will answer that is if we look at what has happened over the course of the last month or so with the positioning of forces, and if you look beyond the headlined forces that were talked about, the F-35s, the aircraft carriers, submarine ships, defense assets, you would have seen behind the scenes if it was reported on, but typically it isn't because we don't talk about it in great detail. You would have seen also the positioning of a tremendous ability to and capability to sustain the operation, right? Every commander that puts any plan together knows that the Achilles heel of a great operation is the supply chain that they have. And it's embedded in what it is military commanders do. They know it's essential. So behind the scenes, you would have seen overtly the movement of significant amount of cargo airplanes and such, and other things that carry these supplies and put them there. And what they weren't carrying was troops this time, but they were carrying was the munitions needed to do that. At the same time, there's going to be a companion plan that's going to be how do I rearm things as they're launched and shot? Because you can imagine some TLAMs get shot. How do I rearm and do that? And so a cycle of how that's done, who's on the front line, who needs to get rearmed is built up. So the reason I bring all that up is for this operation, I have no doubt that the required munitions for a worst case scenario are likely in place. And the hope is that, of course, you wouldn't use it. So the things that you read about typically are, oh boy, the U.S. stockpiles will get into it, et cetera, and we're going to run out. The U.S. likes to have munitions to carry out a significant amount of operations and still husband others for future operations we don't know anything about. So I don't see the U.S. Ken as being in danger of running out of munitions on the offensive side because they would have been repositioned. On the defensive side, I'd say it's the same thing. And one of the reasons that I say that is because what I mentioned earlier, the portion of this offensive mission will be to get at those missiles that can be launched because the commanders that put these plans together know you don't want to be sitting back defending against thousands of arrows. You want to get to where those arrows are being shot from and get to that ability for them to use those. It doesn't mean you need to shoot every arrow. I don't believe we would have enough to do. But what you want to do is get at the choke points for that because they have the same issue on the other side. They don't have everything that they need in each of the locations they need to just keep firing forever. They have to move them from supply depots and such, and then they become exposed when they are, et cetera, and as they approach launch sites, et cetera. So I don't believe that's going to be the Achilles heel of this operation. Will the U.S., when this is over, have some munitions to rebuild, to assembly lines that have to come up to speed so that the stockpiles are again at the level that the U.S. would want to be able to handle multiple things going on? I think the answer is yes. Will it cost money? Yes. But I think that and will Israel also have to be resupplied? I think the answer is yes to that. So it is the supply chain is real. But from what I saw of the movement of forces, because that's what I was looking at, the seriousness of the U.S. to actually execute this operation on the front end, I was looking at were those things going forward with the forces that we put that were more visible, and I saw both things happening. I saw both forces moved and sustainment forces moved, and some rehearsals of how I can rearm and resupply, et cetera. So how long can this go on? I think enough to carry out what's going on because eventually Iran's in the same situation and with less capability to rearm and supply, and certainly almost no capability to build as they're going along. They don't have, those capabilities to rebuild their missiles, to rebuild warheads. That's being taken out. Those would be taken out. So that does, and so again, that's why I look at what's Iran doing. Are they, how long do they want to, they don't want to deplete their entire defensive system either, but maybe they will. And so I don't know if that answers the question to the level you want it, Ken, but I think it gets at, the takeaway that I would have is I don't see that as something that certainly over a course of several weeks is going to be something that's going to force us to not be able to work. And let's see what happens for these continued missile launches that the Iranians have had. Let's watch those over the next couple of days and see the size and shape of those going forward, and then it'll even make my point or maybe disprove it. But that's my assessment.
That's terrific. That's exactly what I was looking for. All right, Alex, next one's for you. And again, multiple questions along these lines. So first off, the Israelis are now reporting that Ayatollah Khamenei was killed, that they have drone footage showing his body being removed from the rubble. The questions for you are all about the process moving forward. So obviously there's a process outlined in the Iranian constitution, but they probably didn't envision these circumstances. So give us your sense as best you can. And obviously, I know this can get very arcane, so let's keep it to the top lines. But what the process might be for the Iranian leadership moving forward in terms of selecting a new supreme leader, or I think along those same lines, do they not bother because it's wartime?
So obviously, Ken, we have to wait and see if that's confirmed. But let me very quickly give a bit of a history here. Iran has had two supreme leaders, one Ayatollah Khomeini, 79 to 89, and then Khamenei from 89 to either today, if he's dead, or he certainly been the second one so far. So there is no history of a supreme leadership in the, you could call him a king because that would fit in with Persian history, but as a religious top figure, this is an anomaly. That this has been around for 47 years, as long as the Islamic Republic's been around. There is no real justification for this in Islam. They essentially made it up in the 70s, this concept. So my point, Ken, is that if they don't have, to your point, another supreme leader, because it's just not expedient, well, then that's fine. Nobody's gonna, I mean, this is not the Catholic Church where you have to have a pope at the top. They could easily do something different. And by the way, I should point out, even folks inside the Iranian regime in recent years increasingly pointed the finger of the unelected and all-powerful supreme leader as being the main obstacle for change. So I think this is got a great opportunity if the news is true. And that takes me to, what comes next. Look, there's a formal part of this, the Constitution, as you mentioned, very quickly. There's an assembly of experts with 88 other senior clerics who will choose the successor to Khamenei. That's what the Constitution says. But again, they've only done it really once in 1989. And back then, we all know what happened. It was a deal that was cut behind the scenes, led by then Ayatollah Rafsanjani, which means that the formality doesn't really matter. The 88 people who are sitting in the Assembly of Experts are not independent actors. They're rubber stamping whatever that's put in front of them, if anything is put in front of them. Who gets to decide if there's going to be another supreme leader? Are those people with political power in their hands at the time? Most likely the Revolutionary Guards, other sort of security intelligence circles would a sort of say, particularly in these conditions. So the idea that, for example, Mohammad Khatami or somebody, reformers, could be put up there as the next supreme leader because that might just ease tensions, that can really only happen in two scenarios. IRGC is essentially out of business, they can't influence it, or they decide that's actually not a bad outcome from their point of view. But I was just quickly, Ken, I know we're almost out of time, going back to what I said earlier. This is a moment for the country of Iran, including many who are in the rank and file in this regime, to come to the conclusion that the Islamic Republic failed miserably in the basics it promised to do over the last 47 years. So why on earth would you go down and chase the idea of another supreme leader, benign supreme leader, when the alternatives could be much better for this regime if it cares about its survival, if it has time to change, by the way, because as we know, the majority of Iranians don't want to see a reformed Islamic Republic. They want to see it gone and replaced with a secular democratic system, although they're obviously having their own fights about what that means when it comes to the details of that future political system. But let me stop there, Ken.
That's great, Alex. Okay, Colby, got a couple of questions. Well, got a couple of link questions for you, but it's basically, again, given the fact that it looks like oil from the Gulf is at least going to be curtailed somewhat, maybe interrupted to a certain extent. What impact does this potentially have on Russian oil, on Venezuelan oil? I mean, there's a lot of oil around that's being subject to sanctions. Does this situation affect their oil? Or in what ways, I should say, because it's obvious stuff.
Yeah, I mean, in the near term, for Russia, which has kind of struggled with buyers a bit, it will help their situation purely because it pushes the price up. I don't think it's going to yield a situation where there's suddenly less sanctions enforcement. It's possible, but again, like the SPR release, as I mentioned earlier, even sanctions enforcement has to be managed fairly carefully, because when you're dealing with major producers like Russia or Iran, you run the risk of taking too much supply off the market and really putting too much upward pressure on prices. That's what the price cap was designed to do during the Russia-Ukraine war, was to constrain Russia's oil revenues without taking too much supply off the market. So Russia will, I think, see some short-term benefit, again, just in terms of the price action. And for Venezuela, look, I mean, Venezuela is a complicated question, because yes, it has a supposedly huge resource base, large reserves. But in addition to the crumbling infrastructure, it's extremely heavy oil. It's very expensive to produce, not nearly on the scale that Iran has. I mean, Darren Woods, the CEO of Exxon, flat out called Venezuela uninvestable a few weeks ago after the Maduro operation took place. So it's not something that I think is suddenly it may be a bit of a boon for Venezuela, in the sense that they'll receive the benefit from the price action as well. But it's not something that's going to lead to a near-term surge in Venezuelan supply because of the higher price. Venezuela cannot act as a swing producer the way the Gulf states can. They cannot simply open and close the taps and put more oil on the market. Their resource base is of a totally different type, and so in the near term, I wouldn't really expect there to be major implications there. I mean, I think there could be some distraction, in the sense that sanctions enforcement might wane a bit, particularly for Russia, if possible. I mean, again, you could be turning a blind eye, because, as we've all come to know, this administration is very, very sensitive to oil prices. So it's possible that there's action there, and of course, other administrations are sensitive to price as well, but this one especially so. I think we have to wait and see whether or not this is a sustained longer-term disruption from the Gulf. We'll have to see what the impact of any potential outage of Iranian supply is, pending the internal situation. But in the near term, it's very difficult to see a major change for any of the other sanctioned barrels that are on the market.
That's great, Colby. And it's great you left us 2 minutes, because I'm going to ask Admiral Donegan one last question, and it's a big one. So, you're going to have to be a little bit superficial, kid. We'll understand that. But we've got a lot of questions asking about our regional allies. And I thought, given the fact that you were out there in Bahrain and you've been in the region for so long, the questions are more or less all along the same lines, which is, how are our Gulf allies, our regional allies, going to respond to this? Are they going to be happy because the Iranian regime will hopefully be gone? Are they going to be unhappy because they told us not to do this and we did it anyway, and now they're all getting hit? And we might end up either with the Iranian regime still in place or with chaos in Iran.
The ultimate question, and so I'll be real brief and maybe just hit it at the wave tops, because you only have about a minute and a half here. So first, we can never group them up as a group, and you know that better than I. It's why we have the Middle East Institute, I think, is because we know every one of them is an independent nation. So I'll say that as a disclaimer up first. But there is a common denominator that they will look at this through, and that's the lens of, they all want stability so that they can have their economies firing on all cylinders and be able to provide for their people in the best way possible. And so when there's war in the region, that doesn't meet that objective, right? So that's the initial short-term look. So it really is going to come down to how it ends. And what they want is a stability in the end, something better than there is now, not something worse. If it's more stable at the end and their economies can thrive and there's not the threat of missiles raining down, and Iran is now on a path towards a better nation, or at least one that's more inclusive and that can be included into helping their economies, I think it'll be better. So time will tell on this, and the how it ends piece is going to be super important. The last thing they want is someone to come in and stir up a hornet's nest, and they're left with the hornets because they're proximate to all this. All these U.S. forces will back away, right? We can keep our bases or close them, doesn't matter. But in the end, they're living in the region, and they want stability in that region so that their economies can thrive and they can take care of their people. And I think that's the lens they'll look at it through, and it's then obvious on the how it ends part is going to determine whether they're happy or not when this is over.
Yeah, I think we kind of all fall into that same category, but that's great, and a great point to end on. So for everyone out there in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found it useful. Again, we are on the record. We at the Middle East Institute are going to continue to do these kinds of virtual briefings in the days ahead. In fact, tomorrow morning at 9:30, we're going to do another one with a slightly different cast of characters. But I promise you that Admiral Donegan, Colby Connelly, Alex Vatanka, you'll be hearing from all of them again in the days ahead. Kid, Alex, Colby, thank you so much. This was terrific, especially